Something just changed in the United States that could affect almost every driver on the road, and most people haven't even heard about it yet. There was no loud national announcement, no flashing headlines telling people to pay attention before they get behind the wheel tomorrow morning. But quietly, inside a Supreme Court decision that many people thought was only about gun laws, something much bigger happened. The reasoning behind that ruling is now influencing how courts think about everyday encounters between citizens and police officers, especially during traffic stops. Think about how common traffic stops are in America. Millions happen every single year. Some are simple. A driver is going a little too fast, gets pulled over, receives a warning or a ticket, and continues on their way. Other stops become more complicated. Officers sometimes discover suspended licenses, warrants, intoxicated drivers, or illegal weapons. Because of that unpredictability, traffic stops have always been treated as one of the most sensitive moments between citizens and law enforcement. But before we break down what changed and why it matters, I want to ask you something directly. If a police officer pulled you over tonight for a routine traffic stop, would you know exactly what your rights are and what the officer is legally allowed to do? Not what people on social media say, not what you may have heard from friends, the actual legal rules. Think about that for a moment. Then tell me honestly in the comments. Would you feel confident handling that situation? Or would you be unsure about the law? Share your answer in the comments, because what the Supreme Court just did could make that knowledge more important than ever. To understand the shift, we need to start with something basic about how traffic stops work under the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures. That principle applies to police stops on the road. Officers cannot simply pull over a car whenever they feel like it. They must have a legal reason. In most cases, that reason is a traffic violation. It might be speeding, failing to signal, running a stop sign, or even something minor like a broken taillight. Once an officer observes that violation, they have the authority to stop the vehicle and investigate. That part of the law has been well established for decades. During the stop, the officer can ask for your driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance. They can also run your information through their system to check whether your license is valid and whether there are any outstanding warrants. All of that is considered routine, but traffic stops become legally complicated when the interaction goes beyond that basic investigation. For example, if an officer wants to search your vehicle, the Constitution usually requires probable cause or your consent. Probable cause means the officer must have a reasonable belief based on evidence that a crime has occurred or that illegal items are present in the vehicle. Without probable cause, officers often ask for consent to search. Many drivers say yes without realizing they have the right to refuse. Now, here's where the Supreme Court's recent reasoning begins to matter. In its decision expanding the protection of the right to carry firearms in public for self-defense, the court made a very important point. It emphasized that law-abiding citizens have the constitutional right to carry firearms outside the home. At first glance, that sounds like a decision focused entirely on gun rights, but constitutional rulings rarely stay confined to one narrow issue. When the court strengthens a constitutional right, that decision affects how other laws are interpreted, and that includes police encounters during traffic stops. For many years, if an officer believed a driver might be armed, that suspicion could sometimes justify additional actions during a stop. Courts often allowed officers to conduct protective searches if they believed someone might be armed and dangerous. The phrase there is very important: armed and dangerous. But if carrying a firearm in public is a constitutional right, then simply being armed cannot automatically mean someone is dangerous. That single idea is now forcing courts to rethink how traffic stop rules should work. Imagine a police officer pulling over a vehicle late at night. The driver appears calm and cooperative. The officer knows that in this state, many citizens legally carry firearms. Years ago, the presence of a gun might have strongly suggested illegal activity in some states. Today, in many places, that same situation may simply mean the driver is exercising a lawful right. That creates a new legal question. If carrying a firearm is legal, can the mere possibility that someone has a gun justify a search or frisk during a traffic stop? Some courts have already started examining this issue. Legal scholars are debating how the Supreme Court's reasoning should apply in these situations. On one side of the debate are those who argue that constitutional rights should not be treated as suspicious behavior. If someone is exercising a legal right, that alone should not justify a search. On the other side are those who emphasize officer safety. Traffic stops can be unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, and officers must be able to protect themselves. Balancing those concerns is one of the most difficult challenges in constitutional law. And that's why this Supreme Court ruling could have ripple effects far beyond the original case. Now let's talk about something that many drivers don't realize. The moment when a traffic stop officially begins. The stop begins the moment an officer activates their lights and you pull over. At that point, the law considers you temporarily detained for investigative purposes. That detention allows the officer to address the reason for the stop, but it also has limits. The stop cannot be unnecessarily prolonged without additional justification. For example, if you are pulled over for speeding, the officer is allowed to investigate the speeding violation. They can check your license and run your information through their system. But if the officer wants to extend the stop to investigate something unrelated, they must have a valid legal reason. This principle was reinforced in earlier Supreme Court decisions about traffic stops. The court has repeatedly emphasized that officers cannot extend a stop beyond the time reasonably required to handle the original violation unless new circumstances arise. Now imagine how firearms enter that situation. If the officer learns that a driver is carrying a firearm, the next question becomes whether that fact creates reasonable suspicion of a crime. In states where carrying firearms is widely legal, the answer may increasingly be no, and that is where the Supreme Court's reasoning begins to quietly influence everyday police encounters. Another factor that complicates traffic stops is something called duty to inform laws. Some states require drivers who are carrying firearms to inform the officer during a traffic stop. Usually, the driver must disclose this information immediately or when asked. Other states do not require this disclosure at all. That means the legal obligations of drivers can change dramatically depending on the state they are in. Imagine someone driving across several states on a long road trip. In one state, they must immediately tell the officer they are carrying a firearm. In another state, that requirement does not exist. In yet another state, their concealed carry permit may not even be recognized. If the driver doesn't understand those differences, a routine traffic stop could turn into a serious legal problem. This is one reason why experts often say that gun owners must pay very close attention to state laws when traveling. Another issue that often surprises drivers involves consent. During a traffic stop, an officer might ask something like, "Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" Many people feel pressured to agree because they believe refusing will make them look suspicious. But legally, you are allowed to say no. Consent searches rely entirely on voluntary permission. If you decline, the officer must rely on probable cause or another legal exception if they want to search the vehicle. Of course, the officer may still continue investigating if they believe evidence of a crime exists, but once consent is given, it becomes much harder to challenge the legality of the search later in court. Understanding that distinction is extremely important. Another part of traffic stops that people rarely think about involves passengers. Passengers also have rights during traffic stops, but those rights can sometimes differ from the driver's responsibilities. If a passenger is carrying a firearm, their legal obligations may depend on state law. Some states require disclosure from anyone carrying a firearm in the vehicle. Others place that responsibility primarily on the person interacting with the officer. This can create confusion if multiple people in the vehicle are carrying firearms. Again, this is why knowledge of local laws is so important. The Supreme Court's decision did not eliminate police authority during traffic stops. Officers still have the power to enforce traffic laws, investigate crimes, and protect their safety. But what the decision did do is reinforce the idea that carrying a firearm can be a lawful exercise of a constitutional right. And once courts recognize a right like that, they must be careful not to treat the exercise of that right as suspicious behavior. Over time, this principle may influence how courts evaluate searches, detentions, and questioning during traffic stops. It may also influence how police departments train officers to approach encounters with armed citizens. Many law enforcement agencies are already adjusting their policies to reflect the reality that more citizens may legally carry firearms. Clear communication during traffic stops is becoming even more important. For drivers, the safest approach during any traffic stop remains the same. Pull over safely, keep your hands visible, stay calm and respectful, follow the officer's instructions. If you are carrying a firearm, know the laws of your state regarding disclosure. If disclosure is required, inform the officer calmly and clearly. If disclosure is not required, understand your rights, but also avoid sudden movements that could cause confusion. Remember that the roadside is not the place to argue about constitutional law. Legal disputes are resolved in courtrooms, not on the shoulder of a highway. What makes this Supreme Court decision so interesting is that its biggest impact may not appear immediately. Instead, it will unfold slowly as courts apply its reasoning to new situations. Traffic stops may become one of the areas where those changes become most visible. And that brings us back to the question I asked earlier. If you were pulled over tonight, would you truly know what the law allows and what it doesn't? Would you know what rights you have during that encounter? Take a moment and think about that. Then tell me in the comments. Because millions of Americans drive every day without fully understanding how these rules work. And when constitutional rights, gun laws, and police procedures intersect, that lack of knowledge can lead to serious misunderstandings. The Supreme Court may have quietly changed the legal conversation about traffic stops. Now, the real question is whether drivers are paying attention.